significant milestone in my van conversion. I have pretty much completed my roof rack. And this roof rack, I have to say, puts a lot into such a small space on a ProMaster City. And because the space is small, I need to take advantage of every square inch. And what I've got up there is 330 watts of photovoltaic. I've got water storage, about 15 gallons of water storage. 7.5 gallons of that is solar hot water. I've got a smart fan up there, and I've created storage space above the van. Now, you may appreciate that with such a small van, it's really important to get as much storage space as you can and to move as much stuff that you can out of the back of the van up to the top. So that's what I've endeavored to do, and I'm going to take you on a little tour of my roof rack.
Let me first say that the roof rack is entirely enclosed by an aluminum siding wrap. And because there's so much stuff up there and there's a large PV panel, enclosing the space beneath the PV panel raised some heat concerns. So initially I was intending to put some venting maybe in the front, maybe put a hole or something there, but after I got into it I discovered that I don't think I need to do that. And the reason is because the roof rack itself extends over the sides of the van a little bit in order to accommodate all of the dimensions that I need. And as a result of that, it hangs over the side of the doors. And therefore I had to cut a little notch, as you'll see, in the side of the wrapping in order to allow my doors to open. And that created a small space that allows air to flow up through there. Now, I decided not to enclose the back of the wrap so that I have air flowing up through the sides of it and out the back. And that sort of obviated the need for me to put in external vents. So the whole wrap kind of, it fully occupies that roof. And therefore, and I felt like I really needed that wrap in order to minimize the wind forces which would exist because there's so much stuff up there, especially if I'm going to put stuff in the storage space between the PV panel and the roof of the van. This is a view of the roof rack without all of the stuff, or most of the stuff, installed. And what you'll notice is that each of those U-brackets is located over an existing mounting point on the roof of the ProMaster City. In other words, I did not drill any additional holes in the roof. I didn't want to. I wanted to use the existing mounts as much as possible. And I have other videos that show how I created those U-brackets made of aluminum and steel and how I leveled them up using rubber from a spare tire and how I got everything to line up that way. Now, it seemed like the placement of everything was determined mostly by the size and location of the PV panel and also the size and location of the MaxxAir fan opening. And the MaxxAir fan opening really had a big impact because I had to be sure to locate that in a place on the interior of the van where I didn't want to cut any cross beams across the roof of the van inside. So I had to have it between spots, and that located the MaxxAir fan on the roof, and it located almost everything else about that. In addition, I wanted to maximize the areas there for the piping that would be used, the 5-inch PVC piping that would be used to store water and then to gravity feed that water down through the roof. So first of all, let me show you how I located that MaxxAir fan opening. Note that the MaxxAir fan is elevated. In other words, the top of the MaxxAir fan is going to be level with the PV panel. It's not going to sit right on top of the van roof. And that is done so that I can create a storage space back there around the panel. Now, the area around the panel is probably going to be covered by netting rather than totally enclosed with aluminum siding or whatever. And the reason is I don't intend for anything up there to be to require waterproofing. I just want it to be open, and the netting will hold stuff in at the back of the van. So that's the purpose for using the collar of the MaxxAir fan to raise the fan up a little bit. First I went inside the van and used a template for the size of the collar and located it exactly where I wanted it to be inside the van, between the struts on the roof. Then I could drill a hole in the center of that template and transfer the template to the top of the van in order to locate where the hole was going to be on the from the perspective of the top of the van. Then I was able to cut out that hole using an angle grinder. The fan is supported by cross pieces across that connect one side of the rack to the other side of the rack. And the height of the collar is determined by how much you want it to stick through the actual roof there. Next I had to create the water tubes, and here I used 5-inch PVC, and as I think I've explained in a previous video, I needed to create baffles, and the baffles are those slots with inserted pieces of PVC located at about approximately a third of the distance, 2/3 of the distance, well, let's see, quarter, a half, and 3/4 of the distance. I have 3 baffles in there, and the purpose of the baffles are to prevent sloshing when the water tubes are about half full, so that when I accelerate and decelerate, I don't have a lot of water rushing, creating stresses on the roof rack. I taped all of those perforations for the baffles as well as I could using sealer tape for RVs, and I tested it to make sure that I didn't have any leaks. This is really subject to substantial leakage if you're not careful. But I did the best I could to keep it from leaking, and I continually watch it to make sure that it's not going to leak. One thing I did not anticipate, which may or may not be an issue in the future, is that if these things get hot, then pressure might build up inside there and tend to push out this tape to create leaks. It's something that I'm going to watch. So far, it hasn't been a problem. After I installed the pipes, then I cut 1/2-inch rigid foam insulation to insulate the sides of the pipe in order to either keep heat in or keep heat out. In this case, I've got the foil side pointing in towards the pipe because this pipe is going to be covered with plexiglass and will be a solar hot water collector. Okay, on the other side of the panel for the other storage, also notice that I have used hose clamps to secure the pipes in place at every U-bracket, and drilled through those to keep everything solid and connected together. On the other side of the van, the pipe is surrounded by rigid foam insulation, which has the shiny side pointed out, because in that case I want to basically keep heat out of that tube, and it will be covered by more insulation and then a aluminum siding cover on top of the entire tube. So that's my cold water tube. I've got one hot water tube and I've got one cold water tube, making sure that the cold water tube is always in the shadow of the PV panel if it's raised up. So that's kind of the rationale behind that water storage up there. After I cut in the rigid foam insulation, I put in some spray insulation right around where the brackets are, because I couldn't fit the rigid foam insulation across those brackets. At the back of the van, I put in a black pipe to basically connect the hot water tank with the plexiglass on top and run it over to the driver's side of the van, or the left side of the van, where there's a hole to pipe the water down into the van. It's a little bit hard to see here because it's hard to distinguish the black pipe from the shadows, but it runs across the back of the van on top of the roof. I considered running it inside the van, but it really just wasn't convenient and it was going to stick out, so I decided that this was the best and easiest, and also if it happened to leak or whatever, it's not going to create a big problem if it's outside of the van. So I ran that connector tube over there on top of the roof. Two pipes come down through the roof of the van. One is for hot water, one is for cold water. Now these aren't the ultimate, the final lengths for those tubes. They may be shorter or whatever, so these aren't glued in there exactly. But my intention is to use garden hose fittings wherever possible. Now remember that I'm designing my kitchen so that I can pull that kitchen outside the van, and that means that there are going to be hoses connected to my water supply, and that will be the most flexible way to do it. Also note that these are all gravity fed. This is all gravity fed. There is a water pump in there, but it's only going to be used to pump water for my shower. So for all of my normal needs, to fill up the water filter for drinking water, and then also to utilize water for hand washing, etc., that's all going to be gravity fed. This is a water level indicator, which is basically a hole drilled in the bottom of the pipe, and then water will come up, and it's open at the top of the little tube here, and it's clear tubing, so I can see what the level of the water is inside the tube from the outside of the van. This is what the roof rack looks like from the top when the PV panel is opened. The PV panel is hinged at 3 points with door type hinges. And then there's a rod on both sides, which is drilled and calibrated in order to give me angles of between 15 and 50 degrees. And I can choose, what angle I want depending on, the time of the year and my location, using a solar calculator that you can get on the web. So I can angle that PV panel however I want, and notice that it doesn't shade my hot water my solar hot water tube, but it does shade my cold water tube. So that helps a little bit. And it also creates, as I've mentioned several times, that storage space which is underneath the PV panel. The PV panel cable connections are located on the hinged side of the PV panel, so that I don't have to disconnect it, or I want to make sure that I'm not stressing those PV connections, the cable connections, when I'm raising or lowering the PV panel. And it creates a fairly nice little space there, which I'll probably cover up to protect the roof, and then I'll be able to store things up in there like, tarps and other things that I don't mind getting wet. Basically nothing too heavy, because I'm not going to put any additional support on the roof there, but and then also I want to keep enough space that I get flow inside there in case that space underneath the PV panel gets hot. One of the features of this setup is that the frame, which is hinged on top of the roof, is such that I can slide the PV panel in and out of that frame. and therefore I can locate the PV panel remotely. And I created these little pigtails here so that I can connect them into the PV panel leads and then connect that to a heavy-duty extension plug, and I can then I can locate my PV panel in the sun while I'm parked in the shade or whatever. So I use the same AC. I use this cord, extension cord. It's the same kind of extension cord I would use to connect my rig to shore power if I wanted to do that, and the shore power plug was located remotely from the van. So it's the same cable, but I created these little pigtails in order to convert from using the cord as an extension cord to using the cord as a 12 volt DC connector. So, and that works pretty well. I'm able to charge the PV panel pretty well, even over a distance of, I think that cable is probably around 45 feet. I didn't measure it exactly, but it's fairly substantial length. So that's pretty much it. I'm pretty satisfied with it overall. There are many places where it looks like it was done by someone who was doing it for the first time, and that's because it was done by someone who was doing it for the first time. But it seems to work pretty well. I've had it up to speeds of 40, 45 miles an hour. I haven't gone out to high highway speeds. One thing I forgot to mention is that this wrap on the around the roof rack is attached using this very high bond tape that you get from 3M. It's pretty expensive stuff, but I have a couple of strips of that in between each of the panels there and the frame of the rack, so I'm pretty confident it's going to hold up pretty well. It was a tedious task of actually getting everything patterned out, templated out to make it fit exactly right, but I was able to do it pretty well using tin snips to cut everything, and so I was pretty happy, I should say. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.